Who do you think wins in the long term? In the long run, which way does the seesaw swing? Is it cyber criminals or security?
Well, I have to say that I think the defenders ultimately will win to some extent. I mean, we won't necessarily win every battle, but I hope that we can win the war.
Welcome to Google DeepMind, the podcast with me, your host, Hannah Fry. We are bringing you part 2 now of our conversation with Flynn, VP of Security at Google DeepMind. In the previous episode, we talked about the terrifyingly large numbers of ways that our digital systems are vulnerable to attack, as well as the ongoing fight to defend them. And 4 is completely full of stories and incredible insights, having spent the last 2 decades at the very forefront of international cybersecurity. So if you haven't watched that one yet, press pause on this, go and have a listen, come back here later. We'll still be waiting for you. But for the rest of you, enjoy the episode. Well, up until now, we've been talking about the real technical challenges that come with protecting our systems. But as you mentioned at the end of the last podcast, that's really half of the problem in a lot of ways, because there is also this very human side too. Who's creating the attacks, the tactics that they're using to trick us as people, and also how all of that is changing in the era of AI. So I wanted to pivot to talk a bit more about that, if I may.
Yeah.
And maybe it's worth us starting off by talking about these bad actors. Like, who actually are they? What is their motivation?
Right. Well, I mean, bad actors come in all shapes and sizes, I guess. There's a number of different, sort of classes of these. I think in general in security, we break them down to sort of nation state actors that I think are largely focused on geopolitical aims, often espionage. Or we've definitely seen offensive cyber attacks that are in support of warfare operations on the ground. I think there's also a recent concern about pre-positioning. So I'll just briefly mention that. Even if there's not a hot war going on between two powers, oftentimes there's cyber offensive operations happening as a pre-positioning.
Like maneuvering in case a hot war starts.
Exactly. So we've seen in some areas signs of this happening in places like power grids or critical infrastructure.
So knowing that there's a potential real-world conflict, you infiltrate the power grid system so that you can act on it later.
That's right. And maintain your presence and validate that you continue to have command and control of those environments periodically.
Right.
So every few months you'll see somebody come back, make sure the lights are on, make sure that their systems still work, make sure they can disrupt things, and then they go away.
Okay.
So that's unfortunately fairly more common than most people would like to admit.
Yes.
And then you sort of see sub-nation state quite a bit. And some nation state activity blurs into this, but a lot of that is financially motivated, right? And so you'll see, for example, ransomware, which I'm sure you have heard quite a bit about over the last sort of 5 years, which is very, unfortunately, quite common. And usually that's an attack that basically causes a company or a person to have their data basically stolen and encrypted, or both, and held for ransom. So the more modern incarnation of this is that you as a company would have a core database that you rely on, as well as a backup to serve your customers, and your whole business depends on it. They would slowly and quietly compromise your company, unbeknownst to you, and then all of a sudden one day they would lock out your ability to get access to your backups and your database, and your whole company is offline. And then you would get a demand for a certain number of Bitcoin or what have you, cryptocurrency, to pay them to get the data unencrypted and your business back and running.
And when you say sub-nation state, is this, I don't know, for example, a country that has a number of sanctions on them? It's sort of a way to generate funds.
Yes, so you do see nation states actually using it as a way to raise funds, but you also see sort of independent attack groups, not sort of loosely affiliated or unaffiliated with nation states conducting these sorts of attacks sometimes as well.
Is there a bit of grey area in terms of whether someone is bad or good? Right, I'm thinking here. We were talking about how there are these zero-day vulnerabilities all over the place. We don't know where they are, but finding them can be worth a lot of money. I mean, if you were an individual searching and found a zero-day vulnerability, you presumably have the choice to sell it to a bad actor, but you could also sell it back to the company itself. No.
Yeah. So in fact, there's a whole active black market, a gray market even, for vulnerabilities, right? And I will say that there's a number of different buyers of those vulnerabilities, right? So some buyers are companies that are trying to equip law enforcement with tools to access, the devices of people who have committed crimes. So in fact, that's a whole component of the ecosystem. And that's, various people have different views on that, but that's definitely one component of the ecosystem. I think also governments are one of the biggest buyers of these things, right? And so, again, it depends on what government you have allegiance to. It depends on how you feel about that, I feel like. But it's worth noting that you're very right. These vulnerabilities are very much worth their weight in gold. They're very expensive. Some of them, can be like we talked about millions of dollars, many millions of dollars, in fact, sometimes. And there's a varied number of people buying these things out there.
That is quite an interesting a way to imagine it then, that it's like treasure hunting, as it were, and Google's kind of coming in and saying, we're going to hunt for all the treasure and then fix it so it no longer has any value.
I mean, that's right, because I see a risk that AI, by its own, if we were to take no action, I think it could by itself disrupt the marketplace, right? Because we know bad actors will do the same things we're doing eventually, which is to find these vulnerabilities and make them, unfortunately, potentially more accessible to more bad actors. I mean, that's the concern, right? Is that there's this wave coming of people using AI that previously was very exquisite, very expensive, to find these 0 days and these vulnerabilities and use them to cause damage. That's the risk. I'm not saying that's going to happen or it's not going to happen, but that's one thing we worry about. And therefore, again, that's why I think it's important for Google and others to invest in these systems to try to do our part, to be the best there is at this, and to use that for good, and to help the ecosystem heal itself and to improve itself and get more resistance, instead of just waiting around and letting the bad actors do it.
I think there's another really fascinating aspect to this, which is about the decision to go public, right? Like the act of transparency as a security measure in itself.
Right.
I mean, tell me about the motivation behind Project Zero. How did that come about?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I have to give credit to the absolute incredible folks at Google over the years that have innovated Project Zero. But Project Zero is really an absolute world-class effort, combining, I think, some of the most elite hackers that have ever lived, that their job day in and day out was to find novel vulnerabilities in systems, and then having a vulnerability disclosure and transparency approach that was designed to help the ecosystem become better. I mean, one of the things that Project Zero introduced to the ecosystem that at the time was unbelievably profound was this idea that there's a 90-day disclosure timeline on all companies. You have 90 days from when you learn about a vulnerability to patch it, or we're telling the whole world what it is.
Wow. At which point, all bad actors can exploit it.
That's right.
For free.
For free.
Not even for sale for $50 million on the dark web.
Right. And at the time, I think everybody was like you are, thinking that this was crazy, right? But what it did is it completely changed the way all people in the industry prioritize security. Because the problem was that attackers, the good guys, would find a vulnerability and disclose it to a company, and then those companies often wouldn't prioritize them. And say, yeah, like we'll put it out in the next release of Windows or whatever it is. And then basically 6 months, a year down the line, nobody fixed it. And then the bad guys, separately and independently found the same vulnerability and were exploiting poor consumers everywhere. And so Project Zero said, no, that's not how this works, which is now it's just normal for everybody to get a vulnerability through a vulnerability disclosure bug bounty program, have a whole system for taking that in, understanding if it's, and then, a lot of times people will pay out and reward, folks for these. And then, I'd say more often than not, these are often fixed within the 90-day window. Again, all thanks to Project Zero. So that was a huge impact on the industry.
Have there been instances in the past then where people have known about really serious vulnerabilities and deliberately sat on them?
Well, I think there's cases of governments doing that because they want to use them to exploit other countries. So that's one example.
Go on, give me an example.
Well, I think probably one of the most famous examples of that in security history is called Eternal Blue. Eternal Blue was widely believed to be attributed to America's agencies that were using these tools as part of national security for defensive purposes and offensive purposes. And, I don't want to call out any particular country or group, but, in the case of Eternal Blue, that was somehow leaked externally as a series of vulnerabilities as part of a toolkit. And then I guess it's worth noting that I think some of the vulnerabilities that were novel in that toolkit were actually weaponized as part of a worm that was called WannaCry. So,
which was the one which targeted the British National Health Service. But the thing is about that one that was interesting as well was that there was a patch that existed for it. Is that right? There was a way that the vulnerability didn't need to necessarily be in those systems.
Yeah, so that's right. A patch was produced somewhere along the timeline by Microsoft, and I believe it was prior to the worm taking hold at NHS. And so I think it's worth an interesting digression to discuss briefly why NHS was so vulnerable to this worm when indeed a patch was available. What happens is often that you go and you try to apply the greatest patches, the latest patches, and you're trying to do the right thing as a security person. If you go into a hospital, you'll be surprised. Those things that are next to the patient's bed are like running Windows, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Or at least the computers that you go and you interact with your bracelet, or whatever to figure out what drugs dosages to give and to take the notes from the doctor. Like these things are running operating systems that we know of. And so as a consequence of that, I'm pretty sure what must have happened is the poor security team came along and was like, we're going to patch these systems. And they tried to apply the patches, and one day it broke half the hospital, right? And then some administrator said, look, our job is saving lives here. We can't have these systems not working. We have a defibrillator and all this stuff. We can't mess around with this. And then they become institutionally risk averse to change in their IT systems. And the side effect of that is that you have short-term prioritization of human health, whereas you end up with these long-term vulnerabilities because you don't have the ability to safely affect change.
Absolutely.
In the environment. And that you see this also in other critical environments like critical infrastructure, like power grids or hydroelectric dams that also often are running based on Windows or Linux systems or what have you. And again, it's the same situation where they're so critical, and ironically, the systems that are the most critical then have a side consequence of having the least acceptance of change. And that lack of acceptance of change means that you have the least ability to affect security improvements into the environment. And so this is unfortunately the way the world is.
Absolutely. But this, I think, does really illustrate the sort of the depth of this problem here, that it isn't just a technical challenge. You have got the human element of this.
That's right.
So let me go on to the idea of social engineering here as a different potential point of failure, of getting in through the human.
Yeah.
How has AI changed the landscape of social engineering?
Yeah, so this is a really important point. I do think this is one of the things about AI that is concerning from a security point of view, is the use of AI to cause deep fakes. You've probably heard of deep fakes. That's basically being able to clone somebody and have a live video experience. So imagine the CFO calls you up on a video conference. It looks like them. They interact and have the same idioms and the same voice as them. And if you're a middle person in the finance team and you get the CFO on the line, you might well be convinced that it's truly them and be asked to transfer money through a wire transfer.
And this has literally happened.
And it's happened multiple times already to this date. And that's one example of a deepfake attack. I think there's other examples that we've seen of more consumer side, where somebody will call up and have cloned their daughter's voice and call them up on the phone and pretend that they're being held for ransom and that the mother needs to send money. You can imagine any of us would struggle to have our wits about us in those types of situations, especially if it sounds like your daughter or your son, somebody you've known for so many years. And so there's a whole bunch of different types of these social engineering type of attacks that are really novel, that are enabled by AI.
But in a way, it's sort of enabled bad actors to make their phishing attacks more directly tailored to the individual they're targeting.
I think that's right. Phishing attacks had already been pretty successful for some time. We had this concept in security called spear phishing. I'm not sure if you've come across that one. And in fact, a fun side note, there's also whaling. So spear phishing is targeted phishing that's sort of bespoke for that individual. And then there's whaling, which is a term for basically going after, CEOs or really high profile people with a very exhaustive fashion. So I think the problem with LLMs is that there's a whole landscape of new social engineering risks that are introduced by them. Again, I try to always give a bit of good news along with the bad news. I think the good news here is that a lot of the best practices historically that we've invented in security are still coming to the rescue, right? So imagine you work at a company, right? We talked about that CFO scenario, right? Well, if you have strong multi-factor authentication that requires not just a face, and a video that looks right, but in order to be able to call you in the first place with such a video system, they would need to be able to have a strong form of authentication that isn't phishable, that's only connected to your finger on your laptop or whatever. Then that is pretty strong defense against that sort of attack, right?
Do you think that we're going to be living in the era of passwords forever? Or do you think that from the consumer side that AI will make that a thing of the past at some point?
Well, before we get all the way to AI, there's actually encouraging progress even well before that. So probably the thing I'd turn your attention to most is something called passkeys. Passkeys are actually a really exciting new innovation that's coming to a login near you. And you might have seen it before. It's essentially when you log in and instead of typing in a password, it'll show a QR code that you can take a picture of with your phone. And because your phone is already logged in on your behalf, it automatically logs you into that service on the web. And I'm a huge fan of passkeys because if you just have a phone, you take a picture of your screen, what have you, you're just logged in. It's easier and it's more secure. I think another thing that you've probably seen some is that if you have multiple touch points, multiple surfaces with a given company like Google, you can do push to login or push to approve. And so like if you're trying to log into a new Google property like YouTube, if you have the Google app already logged in on your phone, you can just go to that and say yes, or on your Gmail account. So those are two examples, I think, of things where we're moving already past passwords as it is, which is great because I think passwords were important innovation at the time, but clearly we all know that human brains are not compatible with passwords.
No, 1, 2, 3 password. That's the
exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really good that we're nearing the post-password era. The one thing I will say about AI here is important to remember is that, of course, AI can play a role too. And so there's a concept in the industry called risk-based authentication. And this has been around for a long time, long before LLMs. And so what this would be is that you basically are connecting to a sensitive system like a bank or something like that. And it basically looks at amasses a number of different signals about your behavior. How's your mouse moving on the screen? What are you clicking on? Does that look organic? You've probably seen like click and say you're not a robot. All of that is tracking your mouse and things like that oftentimes. So in other words, it gains a whole lot of different signals that you're not even conscious of that it's using to ascertain whether you're a real human and whether or not you're really you. And so
the
those,
particular way you type,
yeah.
perhaps.
And so the idea is that, this is pretty common in financial services, but it's really common across the industry, that you obviously want consumers to have the least friction as possible to engage with your service, but you can step up the friction level pursuant to the risk level. And so as you're like looking at what somebody's doing and gathering all these signals and behavioral features, you can actually choose to say, well, normally I would just ask for this person's password because we already trust their browser and we've seen them log in from this IP address before, but their mouse is kind of moving weirdly and their keystrokes don't line up to how they used to line up. And so we're actually going to ask them to do a multi-factor authentication in addition to a password this time around.
That's so interesting.
And so that's actually something that, is only getting improved with AI, but has actually been around for quite some time.
So it's like the system has a belief in whether you are who you say you are, and that changes depending on the circumstances.
Yeah, it's literally a trust score.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it actually calculates based on a huge array of different signals that you're unconscious of.
The thing is, all of this stuff that we're describing is still in the space of like, you need to prove that you're the human so you can do the action. But
That's right.
I mean, the conversations I have with your colleagues, the Google DeepMind people, is that we are moving more and more into an era where agents will be doing stuff on our behalf.
That's right.
So, I mean, if we are moving into that era, if we want these agents to have autonomy, I mean, that changes everything again, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah, I think a lot of us are still contending with this new reality. I mean, I don't claim to have all the answers here. But I do think that, historically we had a fairly straightforward concept between people engaging on the internet. It was either a human or it was a bot, right?
Yeah.
And now we have this sort of third thing, which is a bot acting on behalf of a human, which we call an agent, right? And so I think the question becomes, first, how do you identify that as being distinct from just a bot that's not tethered to a person? And what permission and access does that agent get? And obviously you can imagine agents doing all kinds of good and bad things, both, right? I mean, you'd want an agent to act on your behalf to do, manage your bank account or to do healthy and helpful things on your behalf on the internet. But I think at the same time, some bad actor could easily cause an agent to do negative things on their behalf. So just by virtue of having an agent doesn't necessarily mean it's a good or bad thing. I think we have to understand the sort of provenance of that agent. How much trust should we apply to that agent? What identity is that tethered to? And in other words, who is it? Who on whose behalf is it operating? And how do we trust that? And a lot of that plumbing to make the internet really understand that deeply into the foundation of the internet is still yet, I think, to be built. And then on top of that, Google does have a paper on sort of agent security best practices. So when you're deploying an LLM as just a simple chatbot with no other bells and whistles, a lot of these risks are fairly minimal. But the two problems start to come in when you have untrusted potential input, such as emails or websites, and then its ability to take action. In other words, like making changes to your home, your stove, your microwave. And so when you have those things all together, that's when you start to have challenges. And then moreover, and then the last point I guess I would make is you also have some restrictions about what tools that it can call and what it can do. So it can't just do any kind of random thing. You have some constraints and some rhyme or reason around what tools that it can call and what it can use.
But there's also the question of privacy as well here, right? Because I mean, a lot of the time, the work that you're doing in security is about protecting people's data. But if you've got these autonomous agents who are acting on your behalf,
that's right.
I mean, you will want them to give up your data at certain moments in time.
So this is a super challenging problem. It's a problem we call contextual integrity. But the idea is, how do you, exactly as you say, how do you train these AI agents that we know we will want to act on our behalf to know these things that we don't even know how to articulate in our own mind, which is obviously we want to give our social security number to the tax IRS, but we don't want to give it to our social media friends, right? Well, we know that, but how do you actually articulate that in a way that an agent can sort of be imbued with that behavior? And so that's the challenge of contextual integrity, and something my team works on as well, is teaching Gemini these basic privacy norms that you and I take for granted about what data, both as a consumer, but also on behalf of an enterprise, right? If you have a company and you want to run these agents and you want them to carry out some commercial benefit on your behalf, you clearly don't want it to disclose the intellectual property of your company to everybody on the internet, right? And so how does it know what versions of that are right and what are wrong? And so, right now we're taking baby steps. I can't claim to have solved the whole problem, but the starting point is essentially knowing when to ask for help and when to ask for permission. And I think you'll see that as the sort of next step at Google and probably across the industry, where people start to give more and more trust to these agents, but they're still coming back and saying, okay, here's what I want to do. What do you think? Is this okay? I'm about to make a financial transaction, or I'm about to share this data. And knowing intuitively when to come up for help, that in a way that isn't annoying people too much, right? And so that, I think, is the first step of a long journey, right?
A very long journey.
Teaching AI these privacy norms that even within our own society is somewhat varies across geography and other things, right?
I mean, it really does feel like, on the one hand, you're talking about, multi-million-pound breaches with like fish tanks and smart thermometers, right? Like the kind of most basic stuff that really you learned to defend against 15 years ago.
Right.
And then on the other hand, we're talking about right around the corner, this potential future where you have agents interacting with agents, no humans involved, and the whole set of norms hasn't even been written. I mean, it feels like you've got quite a lot of work to do.
There's quite a lot of work to do, I will say. Both, sort of building trustworthy agents, against the attacks that you and I discussed, such as prompt injection and jailbreaks, and then making it so that, once you have these trustworthy agents, being able to run in a sort of trustworthy and repeatable fashion, imbuing it with the norms that we all take for granted in terms of privacy.
Who do you think wins in the long term? In the long run, which way does the seesaw swing? Is it cyber criminals or security?
Well, I have to say that I think the defenders ultimately will win to some extent. I mean, we won't necessarily win every battle, but I hope that we can win the war. The day job of competing between all these different AI labs is all well and good, but I do want to say that I really am proud of the fact that we all are finding ways to sort of, defend our customers together. And so there's a lot of great papers coming out. I think we're having conversations appropriately about how to co-invent these solutions together. So that's been a really good sort of bright part of the story, is that it's not just one lab trying to do this, but it's really all of us are linking arms and trying to defend the future of agents together.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really appreciate the time.
Really fascinating.
There is something about the picture that Four paints here. It's as though you have all of these exquisitely dangerous treasures or vulnerabilities dotted out there in the digital world that are waiting to be found. And the only way to make sure to keep them out of the hands of bad actors is for a company with the might and compute of Google to go out there, hunt them down and patch them before anyone else has the chance to. And okay, sure, as soon as agents come into play, lots of the existing rules and norms are going to need completely rethinking. And maybe we don't have all of the answers for that yet. But one thing I think you can be sure of is that at the very least, this is the team to take it all very seriously. You've been listening to Google DeepMind, the podcast, with me, your host, Hannah Fry. If you enjoyed this terrifying and yet also strangely comforting view of humanity's vulnerabilities, then you might like our other episodes. We've got plenty more where that came from. So please do like and subscribe on YouTube or leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time.